Welcome to this preview for Oregon Bach Festival's commission of An American Mosaic, composed by Richard Danielpour and performed by pianist Simona Dinerstein. My name is Brian McWhorter. I'm Associate Professor of Music at the University of Oregon and the Music Director for Orchestra Next and the Eugene Ballet. For 15 years, I also had the great pleasure of playing in the Oregon Bach Festival Orchestra. Over the past few weeks, you have submitted your questions for composer Richard Danielpour and pianist Simona Dinerstein. And today we'll spend the next hour hearing the answers to these questions from the artists themselves. Before I formally introduce our speakers, I want to thank our corporate sponsor for this project, Pacific Source Health Plans. I also want to thank each and every one of you. Support from all of you is why Oregon Bach Festival is able to offer free concerts like the premiere of An American Mosaic on December 6th at 2 p.m. Pacific Time. With that, let me introduce you to our fabulous panelists. Simona Dinerstein's most recent appearance at the Oregon Bach Festival was in 2018 as the soloist for Philip Glass's Piano Concerto No. 3, a piece that was written for her. And her most recent release, A Character of Quiet, has been playing in my living room on repeat for a few days now. In various iterations of her biography, she also mentions her Old English sheepdog Daisy. And I think, as we all know, pets are more important these days than ever. Welcome, Simona.
Thanks for having me. Daisy's on the side. She said thank you.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. Richard Danielpour is one of the most sought after composers today, period. I've personally had the pleasure of performing many of his works, including Urban Dances. And in 2018, Oregon Bach Festival premiered The Passion of Yeshua, a towering work that captured all of our attention. There's currently no evidence that Richard Danielpour has any pets at all, but he just recently promised a moment ago to write a piece for Daisy, Simona's dog. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you so much, Brian.
I really appreciate both of you being here, and I figure we'll just jump in to this first question. Richard, let's start at the beginning. Tell us about the inspiration for this piece and why you considered Simona for this vital role.
You know, we were talking earlier about how there are some works that a composer writes that don't have all that much of a backstory. You know, you have an idea or institution decides to commission it, and because you're a professional, you do it. But this work has, I think, a more interesting backstory than almost anything I've ever written. This is actually this was the 134th commissioned work that I completed in 40 years. I completed it on the anniversary of the day I received my first commission.
Wow.
40 years ago. But what precipitated it was that in April and May, I was actually informed by my doctor at the end of March that because of my asthma, I was considered in the very high risk group for COVID, and that my chances of survival, if I were to contract the virus, were about 30% at the most. On top of that, my wife had actually taken her youngest son to New Hampshire and has been there for quite some time. And so I was by myself, and I would go to sleep at 11 p.m. and I'd wake up at 2 and not be able to go back to sleep because I was, dealing with all the anxiety about safety issues, my doctor on April 1st said, that's it, you're on lockdown for 40 days. You're not allowed to go out. You better have friends bring you things you need, have everything delivered. And, what I did, I thought after a few days of just staring at the ceiling at 2 a.m., I thought, it's time to either get busy living or get busy dying. And in that time between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m., I wrote an opera libretto, which I'm actually about to start setting to music rather soon. But, I had every kind of pill. My doctor had prescribed for me everything, right? Nothing was working. But I remembered that I had purchased a recording of Simona Dinerstein's 2 and 3 part inventions just before the pandemic hit. And I liked it so much, I had it playing in my car all the time. And then I went on Spotify and discovered that she had a recording of the Goldberg Variations, which was actually written for an insomniac all the way back in 1742. And I started playing it, and I felt this incredible quality in the sound of her playing. It was like just first of all, fiercely intelligent music making, but with incredible warmth and heart and tenderness. And it put me in that position of just being able to finally relax and go back to sleep. And I did this every day for about 6 weeks. Finally, I'm getting now to the end of May, and I'm thinking, I got to thank this woman somehow. She's just, she has just literally kept me out of the hospital, right? In the meantime that this has been going on, I've been thinking, I've also got to write an hour-long piece that pays tribute to all the heroes in this pandemic, all of the people who've struggled, suffered, prevailed, and in some cases not actually made it. And I thought if I could get one person, I'm preferably a pianist, I was thinking, to live stream this event at a time when we're going to be at our lowest. I knew already in May that by the end of the year, it's going to be a tough Christmas and Hanukkah for a lot of people. I thought that would help, and I mean, I saw what was going on, and I wanted to just hug everybody who has been so heroic, but I can't do that. I've only got my music, I've only got the work that I do. So the first thing I did was call Michael Anderson, and, because I remembered that Simona had come to Oregon just the day after I left, after the Passion of Yeshua. She came to play the Glass Concerto and I think Bach keyboard concertos, if my memory serves me correctly. And so I said, will you please get me this amazing woman's email? I just need to write to her and thank her. She just saved my ass. She just kept me out of the hospital. And he said, oh, I'm more than happy to do that. I'm sure she won't mind. I'm sure she knows who you are. And then the conversation steered away, and he said, by the way, what are you working on? And I said, well, I've got this idea now, after having written the first draft of a libretto, I've got this idea for an hour-long work I want to write that's dedicated to the heroes of this crisis that we're in the middle of. And I also want to have these 4 consolations, these 4 angels who come to comfort the suffering. And they're in the piece, like the equivalent of a set of variations. One is a one-voiced monodic line, the other is a 2-part invention, the third is a 3-part fugue, and the last one at the end of the piece is a chorale in 4 voices. I said, I just have to find the right pianist. And there was a silence on the other end, and Michael said, well, what about Simona? And, honestly, she was like this goddess from Brooklyn, who I just was like at the point of nearly, wanting to get on one knee in front of her. And I never really thought that she would necessarily be interested in this. But the moment he mentioned it, I thought she's the exact perfect person to do this, because the heart and love and intelligence and compassion. I was saying to somebody the other day, how when you go to a restaurant and it's a family run restaurant and you can taste the love in the food, you know what I'm saying? You can hear the love in her sound.
Yeah.
And that's what I wanted. And so I emailed her, I sent her probably one of the best fan letters I've ever written to anybody. And she responded right away, and we set up a FaceTime chat. I shared with her my idea. She seemed to like it very much. And 5 days later, the Oregon Bach Festival decided to commission it. And I started working on it on June 3rd,
Ah,
and I finished it on August 3rd.
amazing. Simona, what was your reaction when you heard from Richard? What drew you to this project? And I'm particularly interested in the unique challenges of preparing for this kind of performance given this lockdown and the pandemic.
Well, I mean, I was so surprised to receive this amazing email from Richard, and then to speak with him. I was really, I mean, it's kind of hard to imagine that you make a recording and you send it out into the world, and it's speaking to somebody so profoundly like that. The way my music was speaking to Richard was, it was very meaningful, and I was really, really touched by that. And then I thought that the piece that he wanted to compose sounded really, like, really meaningful and relevant right now at that time. And it's still, I think his music is really powerful and beautiful, and I just really wanted to be part of it. I thought it was a great plan. At that time, I was slightly daunted because when Richard called me, I was going through a little bit of a low point myself, and I was finding it hard to practice. And so he said he wanted to compose this, huge work, and I realized, and the premiere would be in December, and I realized that that would be a lot of work for me, and that I would have to practice. And I think it was actually very good for me to have that project, because it did make me, it was one of the things that spurred me back into action. I have had pieces written for me before by composers, but every composer has a very different way of going about it. And I was struck by the fact that Richard had a very, very clear idea of the music before he sat down and wrote it. I think in a way it seemed to me that he had already written it in his head, and then he just sat down and transcribed what was in his head. And that was just really surprising to me. And uh, I started receiving the movements in July. One of Richard's former students, I guess.
He's now my assistant, yes.
Your assistant. He was like typesetting them, because Richard still is one of those composers who actually writes by hand. And interestingly, the other two composers that I've worked with recently are also by hand writers, which is nice. I feel like I seem to connect with composers that have that way of writing. But I would receive the music, and then I'd start working on it, and then I would write to Richard with any questions that I had about it. And there's a lot of back and forth, and I feel like I very quickly kind of connected with his music, and I just spent this past week recording it. So it's a very fast turnaround for me to learn such a big piece.
And to follow up with that, Richard, is it true what Simona is saying, that you had the music in your head and you just transcribed what was in your head?
Just to be perfectly accurate, a lot of the music I had already sort of heard and sort of saw, and basically some of it I took it down like a good secretary, Some of it I had an idea of the type of music I needed, the character of each movement that I needed. And then, I mean, just for instance, the 14th movement, which is titled Prophets and Martyrs, and is dedicated to the Black Lives Lost
Mm.
and to Black Lives Mattering during the pandemic. I stole a little something from my opera Margaret Garner, which I wrote with Toni Morrison. And I knew I was going to do that. I just knew right away I was going to do that. But the some of it is verbatim, and then some of it is just sort of like a blueprint idea. But for me, I think first like an architect when I write. I have to sort of see the layout, and I knew this piece would be just under an hour. And in fact, the last work that I wrote, major work that I wrote, was for Susan Graham and music from Copeland House with the poet Rita Dove. And I said, this is going to be an hour. And it turned out to be 63 minutes. I was 3 minutes off. I
Must have been
said,
slow.
this is just, and we actually added a movement. Rita wrote an extra poem about the pandemic, which I just finished last week.
Oh,
So there are 15 movements, just like this work has 15 movements, interestingly enough. But I should also explain something, that when a composer actually lives within his head, as we all do, right? And writing everything by hand, I'm hopelessly 20th century. I'm very old fashioned in this way. I only started using email in 2001. But when you know who you're writing for, and you know how extraordinary the person is that you're writing for, it sort of lights a fire inside you. And I have to just say, I just want to go on record here. I think that Simona is one of the great miracles in the classical music world today. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that. There is something about the way she makes music that is healing. And we need this now more than we ever do. It's so important to have an artist who can speak in such a way that in the very sound itself is an embrace. And, in that way, that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be able to, with this piece, hug everybody that I could, at a time when we almost need it. We all need it most. And this is the only person that I could ever have imagined would be right for this work.
yeah. And along those lines, I think as a musician myself, I've been particularly moved, not just by Simona's playing of late, like I mentioned, this record that's been playing in my house, but also I want to mention that I have so appreciated how you, Simona, have been upfront about your own creative process in this pandemic and kind of being vulnerable enough to share how that has unfolded, because I think so many musicians and creative artists can relate to that. This next question kind of gets to that. This is from Jonathan in Connecticut, and it's for Simona first and then Richard. How do you find inspiration to create this work when it seems like the world is falling apart? Assuming the work was written months ago in isolation and the recording just took place, it still would have taken a great deal of personal motivation and deep emotional charge to produce something so beautiful. How does that all work internally for you?
Well, that's a very good question. To be honest, we were supposed to record this in Mechanics Hall in Worcester, in Massachusetts. And a week ago, the rates were going up very rapidly in both Massachusetts and New York. And my producer called me and said, I don't think we should go to Massachusetts. I think it's unwise. And so we had to shift the whole recording video process to my house, which is where I recorded the album A Character of Quiet that you referred to. So it does feel a little bit like deja vu all over again, when we're back at my house recording. I think that um, when Richard first started sending me the music, which was in the summertime and things were still uh, in New York, we were just starting to feel a little bit better about how things were going, but it was still extremely recent past that we had been the worst part of the United States for the pandemic. And I found the music that Richard sent extremely moving, and and I found that it spoke to me. At that time, like I felt that there was not a lot of music that did speak to me that I felt that I could um, could mirror how I was feeling in actually in a positive way. Um, I think part of the problem that I have found throughout all of this is that I find it very hard to both listen to music and play music.
Mm-hmm.
I don't, it's, I can't find the right music for the feeling of isolation or the feeling of um, being kind of, I think we're all sort of in a state of shock in a way. Collectively, as a world, as in the whole world, it's a lot to go through. Um, so, how to answer the question more succinctly? Recording this at home this week felt like the right place for it for me. I felt like it's private music in a way. It's even though it's about like the movements have titles that refer to doctors, journalists, teachers, students, children, parents. It's like, but it's almost like a book. It's almost like reading a book, except you're listening to music or you're playing music. But there's a feeling of narrative to this piece. And when you are absorbed in a book, you are in your own world. You create this imaginary world that you dive into when you open up the book. And I think that there's that quality to an American mosaic. And so recording it privately in my room where I do all my work and where I have my private music making going on felt like the right thing to do this week.
I want to dig a little bit here before I give the same question to Richard. Or Richard, you had something you wanted to say?
Yeah, this is what Simone is saying is so, it's powerful for me to hear this, because in the last 9 months, it's actually been more difficult for me not to compose music than to compose, because for me, composing is a testament to being alive. When I'm writing, I feel the most alive. So, people say you should take a vacation, you should take a break. Why should I take a break when I feel radically alive when I compose? In a way, the act of writing for me has been healing. And, if anybody wonders about this, I've written over 100 minutes of music in the last 9 months. I have never in my life, in the course of an entire year, written 100 minutes of music. It just never happened. So it's because I've needed this in order to sort of, it's also a way of saying this will end. I keep looking forward to the moment when we can make music together again. It is an act of will, but it is also a surrender to the energy that passes through us that somehow lets us know this is all going to be all right at some point. And you know, I've been speaking with many performers who have not been able to use their voice to perform, right? But what I'm thinking as I'm sitting here writing is that I am waiting in the music I am writing. I am preparing for the day when they will have a voice,
Yeah.
when they will be able to speak, and I will give them something to play so that when that day comes, we will be able to affirm the fact that we have made it through this, that we have made it through even having a monster in the White House while this is all going on. You know, that we have been able to survive even that, you
Hmm.
see. There's a movement, you know, in an American Mosaic called The Invisible Enemy, which is about the virus itself. There is a movement also called The Visible Enemy, and it is a twisted um, grotesque variation on America the Beautiful, it relates to it in some oblique way. And you know, this was thoroughly intended
Hmm.
as a portrait of the current occupant of the Oval Office, who, thank God, is leaving on January 20th. I thank God every morning that I wake up that this horrible human being who has done so much damage and who has been inadvertently responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of people because of his cavalier and careless attitude toward the pandemic is finally leaving. You know, and for those people who think, oh, he's never going to leave, he's going to run, he's going to be spending most of the rest of his life in court, um, dealing with defending himself. So, you know, when January 20th comes, I haven't had a drop of alcohol since April, but when January 20th comes, I'm going to break out the most expensive bottle of scotch that I have, and I'm going to have a drink.
Wow. I love this. The spectrum here is quite amazing. And actually, just to go back a little bit, and something I wanted to dig into, you know, how we all process this moment as artists, I think varies substantially. Simona, you had this interview with Mary Louise Kelly where you were talking about taking a long period of time off. Um, and maybe I think you said you were lucky if you were able to practice an hour a day, which for a pianist at your level is quite low, right? Or at least that's what the understanding would be.
Yeah.
But somehow you surfaced, and when Adam Abe's house, this your producer, and who I believe deserves the George Martin Award for for this whole project, perhaps. When he encouraged you to go back in, you discovered something. You discovered that somehow your playing had well, how would you describe it?
I think what I said to her was that I had discovered that my playing and my interpretations had deepened over the course of time
And you
without
were
me.
surprised by that to some
Yeah,
degree, right?
I was very surprised because I am used to practicing. You know, I'm a real practicer, and I feel like I think that everything is a process that I develop through practice. And what it revealed to me was that there's a lot taking place inside of ourselves when we don't even realize that it's happening. You know, that sometimes stopping and having a break actually can be transformative. And I didn't know that before.
I love how you just described that. It's almost like you were practicing while you weren't practicing. That somehow your process was still engaged. And that's so moving to me, and it's also moving to hear, Richard, the difference for you. You just kind of throw down into your work, and it becomes cathartic for you. Um,
It's also really ultimately an act of surrender. You know, I have to be like a child again before I start composing a work. I might sort of make a plan, but I'm always aware that a plan can give way to a better plan. Um, and I feel like I have to empty myself completely and become, in a way, become like a clean slate, like a child. Because then when you create that space, then there's the possibility for a sense of wonder, a sense of something that's not controlled. You know, music cannot be manufactured, I think, when it's really at its best. It can only be received. One thing I just wanted to say, because I think this is important. A lot of the music that I write comes from having dreams.
Hmm.
And in one of the few periods that I actually was asleep during April and May, I had this dream that I was literally just sitting there in bed crying, and that an angel came to comfort me, and this angel was so just like light filled, just full of light. And she put her wings around me, just comfort. And then that's where I got the idea of the four consolations, you see, because I wanted to extend that idea to other people as a way of sort of hope, of engendering a sense of hopeful energy. What, the thing that's interesting about artists in general, pianists, composers, violinists, conductors, is that we give away everything we make. And one of the things that I never ever forget is, and this I think about with singers, is that when they sing my music, that breath is given away. They can never take that breath back again. And we're only allowed so many breaths in the course of our lifetime, right?
Hmm.
So, I feel, for that reason, I feel such a sense of gratitude for the people I've been able to work with over the years. But in this very unusual time, I just want you to know that I feel an extraordinary uh, feeling of gratitude for Simona in the way she's collaborated with me. Um, it's
Well,
been very, very special.
let's talk about collaboration, Simona. This pandemic has kept us from our conventional ways of collaborating. So this question comes from Barbara in Oregon. Um, you obviously are an experienced collaborator, but how did this pandemic affect collaboration from your previous collaborations? What positives and negatives can you share?
Uh, well, in terms of collaborating with another performing musician, um, I've only had one experience so far, which was that I went to Boulder and I recorded Bach and Mozart with the Boulder Philharmonic. Um, it was very unusual. Like we were filmed in an airplane hangar because we could have the sides open, so there was air, and we were all at least 6 feet apart from each other, and I led them from the keyboard, and we just had a reduced number of string players that played, and everybody was wearing masks. So it was, on the one hand, wonderful to finally play with other musicians, but on the other hand, it was very frustrating because I felt really far from everybody and I couldn't read their faces because everybody was wearing a mask. And I realized how much of musical collaboration has to do with
Hmm.
looking at each other. I never realized that so much, but so that was interesting. That's the only collaboration I've had playing with somebody else.
Well, and I'm thinking of collaboration more broadly, I guess. For our purposes, I'm thinking of your collaboration with Richard on this piece.
Yeah.
Did the pandemic affect how you collaborated, or did it feel differently to you?
I think that we also, Richard is in LA and I'm in New York, so even had there not been the pandemic, we don't live near each other. So we talked on the phone And at a certain point, I sent Richard a bunch of videos of me playing his music, just so he could give me some feedback if there were things that he wanted to change. It's interesting, the collaboration between a performer and a composer. You know, I'm used to working with dead composers, and
Aren't we all?
and I do wonder. I even wonder sometimes if I had access to those composers, like if I could actually ask Bach a question. Um, I have different ideas. It's hard to say this in front of a composer, but I personally feel that after somebody composes, the music takes on a life of its own that is almost apart from them, and that that the act of sending that music out into the world on a piece of paper, um, that people are going to receive it in different ways, and it might go into different directions, and it might transform into a piece of music that's different than what they originally conceived of. Also, it can hold, I think the better the music, the more different interpretations it can hold. I think when music isn't deep, it only holds, limited numbers of ways of interpreting it. Whereas, you take Bach, like my son just sent me, uh, he did a heavy metal version of the aria from the Goldberg Variation, and it actually sounds fantastic. And I don't know. So the collaboration between the performer and the composer, I think, is just very different than performer and performer.
I can't wait to hear what Richard has to say about this. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
this is really interesting stuff. First of all, I've never been a musical fascist. I've never thought that there's only one way that my work can be played. I've had evidence of it because I've been fortunate enough to not just have many orchestras and individuals playing the same works, but I've arrived at that terrifying age where now I have more than one recording of the same work, which is a little bit daunting for me. But nonetheless, it's a nice thing. It means that, pieces that I've written 25 years ago are actually literally in the repertoire, and are being performed still today and on the radio still today. However, what I learned is that there is really a kind of double surrender when you actually begin to write a work. You surrender to what comes through one. I always say to people, I'm the gardener, I'm not the garden. But there's the second surrender in which you give it away. And when I wrote that letter to Simona, I said to her, the only person that I know who plays Bach in a way that is as convincing as the way you play it is an old friend of mine who's a cellist, and his name is Yo-Yo. I remember so fondly, I've written two cello concertos for Yo-Yo Ma, but the first one, which the Philadelphia Orchestra recorded, he premiered in 1994 in San Francisco. And backstage, the night of the premiere, he put his arm around me and he said, it's not going to be perfect the first time. And I said, that's okay, Yo-Yo, it's fine, don't worry. And then he said, and it's not going to be perfect the second time either. And I said, it's okay, it's all right, it's all right. He said, but I promise you that once it's right, it'll never be wrong again. I remember hearing him say that. And they did it 5 times with the San Francisco Symphony in September 94. And I remember the 5th time, he nailed it. And I went up on stage to take my bow, and I whispered in his ear, I said, the piece belongs to you now. It's yours. And there is this feeling of giving your work away, like you give your baby away, so that it might live, and
Yeah.
then the baby grows up and has a life, hopefully.
Yeah. Richard, this is a question from Michael in Oregon. The variation form has a long and distinguished history, as you know, including keyboard masterpieces by Bach, Beethoven, Brahms. Were you inspired by the works of your predecessors, and how did they influence your musical thinking?
Well, to answer this question really honestly and without skirting around things, it's impossible for a composer who's literate, who knows the repertoire, not to have all that work inside you. It lives inside me. Um, and in fact, just for example, I'm teaching a course on late Beethoven, on the last works of Beethoven. I have spent 40 years trying to understand how this beast of a man thought. And around the time I turned 50, I was just starting to get the idea, you know. Um, Now I almost feel like I could, I often think to myself, what would Beethoven do? What would Stravinsky do? What would Debussy do? You know, because the composers who really do their homework develop levels of intimacy with the composers who've preceded them and those who've entered the repertoire, precisely because we are all part of a continuum. We're all connected. And so, yes, the answer is an unequivocal yes. And the thing that I would say that's so fascinating about this collaboration is that Bach is what brought us together.
Mm-hmm.
The music of J.S. Bach is what brought us together. When I was 17 years old, I listened for the first time to the St. Matthew Passion, and that was the moment that I knew I was going to be a composer.
Mm-hmm.
I can't explain why, I just knew at 17 when I heard that piece. I I decided as a sophomore, I was a double major at the New England Conservatory, and I decided I would spend my sophomore year learning as much of the Well-Tempered Clavier as I could, because I heard Beethoven as a teenager learned it. And so I thought if it was good enough for Beethoven, it damn well better be good enough for me. So I started learning it, and when it came time for my jury, I gave them a list of 17 preludes and fugues, and they wanted to throw me out of the school because I didn't have a classic and romantic piece. Um, you know, so in this way, Bach has always been a part. For years, I would start my day by playing something of Bach before I even started composing. My old friend Toru Takamitsu told me that before he started writing a new work, he would play the entire St. Matthew Passion from beginning to end. And he said, because I'm not a very good pianist, it would take me over a week to do it. But but it was his way of getting into the zone. So it's highly appropriate that when we realized that American Mosaic was just a little too short for a recording, we needed something else. We needed some additional tracks. And I asked Simona what she would like to do, and she said, well, this is already a lot of work, but I have an idea. I'm wondering if you would be interested in it. Would you possibly be interested in making a few transcriptions of Bach for piano? And I said yes, and I walked away thinking, oh, this is going to be really a chore. This is going to be really hard work. And it was one of the most humbling and uplifting experiences I've ever had in my whole life as a composer. It was as if for the 3 weeks that I wrote these transcriptions that I was standing in front of God.
Huh.
It was so unbelievable. And again, how fitting that as part of this performance live stream on December 6th, as part of the concert premiere that we will do in July in Oregon, and as part of the recording, those 3 Bach transcriptions will be a part of this recording. It was truly besher, to use the Yiddish word, um, and I'm a Middle Eastern Jew. My parents are from Iran, but I borrow Yiddish once in a while. Um,
That's great. So, Simona, I'm curious. It sounds like for Richard, you know, the keyboard variations that have a distinguished history aren't necessarily a burden. But I think as a performer, it can sometimes feel differently, especially when you're recording works by a dead composer, and also when you're recording works by a composer who's alive. Do you have performances from performers that kind of live in your mind when you're doing these recordings?
Uh, I'm sure that I do, but I really try not to. I think that uh, there's a tremendous burden of, of oral tradition
Hmm.
in the way that we're trained as classical musicians. Uh, I think that um, it's very hard to feel that it's possible to think for yourself. And so I was very lucky in the teachers that I had because they were, I had three main teachers who were all very, very interesting musicians in very different ways. And they were all very influenced by their teachers. So it was very important for them to teach me a tradition that they had received that had gone back, like I'm like, what, seven handshakes away from Beethoven. Um, and But when I stopped studying, I felt it was time um, to look at a score and try to understand what it meant to me, what I was actually hearing when I saw it, um, and it's it's a very scary process to try to think for yourself, and especially scary is that sometimes when I'm looking at a score and studying it, it keeps on saying something to me that I haven't heard. And if I dare to follow what it is that it's saying, then I might be playing it in a rather unorthodox way. Um, but it just keeps on saying this when I'm trying to understand it. And so I try to follow my instincts with music and um, not be too swayed by whether or not I've heard those things played in that way. Um, but it is a difficult process. I mean, we just have so many voices in our heads, all of us.
Oh, and you're right. The training that we engage in doesn't necessarily prioritize agency. Um, I really appreciate how you just said that, and I hope if there's any students listening that they heed that advice. Richard, let's talk about beyond the commission. This is a question from Richard. What are the reasons you continue to compose professionally after 40 years? Have you had a singularly life-changing composition? Now that an American Mosaic is moving forward, what's your next project?
Those are all great questions. There are three of them,
There are
so
three. Yeah.
I'll try to answer each one.
I'll remind
Uh,
you if you get lost.
I mean, for me, you get to a point where you don't, when you're younger, in your 20s and 30s, even into your early 40s, maybe, you feel like you have something to prove. And then you get to a point where you realize you've been blessed, you know, exponentially, and you don't really feel you have anything to prove. And so the reason for doing a lot of what we do shifts. But for me, I've always felt, even from the time I was in my early 20s, that writing music was an attempt to help in some small way make the world a better place than the way it was when I found it. And as I get older, I feel more and more that music is a catalyst for healing. I feel that it's not what heals, but it opens the door to the possibility for healing and the experience of it. Um, Beethoven, by the way, was very, very aware of this. Um, he wrote, his one of his the third movement of his Opus 132 string quartet, which is referred to as the Heilige Dankesang. He writes high praise of thanks to God for delivery after a long illness in the Lydian mode. And of course, the Lydian mode was the mode used by the Greeks to heal infirmities. He was well aware of this. He also went to the home of Dorothea von Ertmann, who was a wonderful pianist to whom he dedicated his Piano Sonata Opus 101. And she had lost one of her children in a bombing during the Napoleonic Wars, and she had become nearly catatonic after this. And her husband went and found Beethoven and said, "Will you please come and do something? I'm afraid I'm going to lose my wife too." And he came and he played for almost 90 minutes, the story goes. And finally, after about an hour and a half, Frau Erdmann began to sob and wail. She finally had a vehicle for expressing her grief. And he touched her on the shoulder, and he went. He said not a word, and he left. I mean, so there are many stories like this, and I have had many experiences. When I was 26 years old, I arrived in Rome after having been given a prize at the American Academy in Rome. I was supposed to stay there for 4 months, and my appendix ruptured, and the doctors saved my life. They were aware. They told me they saved my life. They told me I was this close to losing my life. And they told me I would be in the hospital for at least a month because I was toxic. I was poisoned. I was jaundiced. And all I did during that time was listen to recordings, cassettes. We had cassettes in those days of Mozart, Beethoven, Brahms, and Mahler. That's the music I had. And I had scores. And I just listened to that music constantly. Finally, they said, it's 12 days that you've been here and you shouldn't be discharged, but you're fine. You can leave now. And I said, it's the music. It's the music that healed me. And I didn't write very much that summer because I was so weak, but I planned the next 5 years of my life in terms of what I would write. And everything I wrote after that incident was more or less interesting, as opposed to everything I wrote before that, which was remarkably uninteresting. So, that was a big turning point in my life. And it reminds me of a line that Andrew Young, who was very close to Dr. Martin Luther King, said when Dr. King said to Andy Young once in jail, you're not really ready to live for anything until you found something worth dying for. So when you get to that point, and you've been given a second birthday, so to speak, it becomes very life affirming.
So what's your next project?
The next project is an opera, which I think I mentioned.
Oh yeah, the libretto, right?
That I had this idea came to me in a flash after having, for the first and only time in my life, been to Las Vegas for 3 days. And I stayed in a remarkable 5-star hotel, and it was the worst experience I've ever had in a hotel in my life. The title of this work is The Grand Hotel Tartarus, and it's a very dark comedy and commentary on the dis-ease and greed and out of whackness in our society and in our country today, and the need for healing and compassion. It's a dark comedy with a very touching ending. I will probably start working on this fairly soon, and it's probably going to take about 2 years of my life. It's like writing a novel.
Yeah.
Richard, can I ask, when were you at the American Academy in Rome?
Well, the first time was in 1982, and then that was the incident that I was just. Then I went back in 1990 for 2 months, And then I went back again for 6 weeks in 1995. And I'm actually on the verge of a sabbatical this fall. And I'm hoping actually to go back there to write some of the opera for the first time since 1995. Hopefully they won't shut me out.
You know, my father is an artist, and he was at the American Academy in Rome. So when I was a child, I lived in Rome when he was at the Academy.
Do you remember what year?
So I think it was from, we were there for 2.5 years. I think it was 76 to 79, maybe.
Right. That was yeah, 76. I was too young.
It was Bob Beezer who was there.
Yes.
And
Yes.
Chet Biscardi and John Thau.
Yeah.
I used to play in the garden. They didn't allow children onto the academy grounds except for special occasions, but we were allowed in a garden across the street, and I have very happy memories of playing in the garden.
It's a beautiful villa. Did you ever, they have Liszt's piano, the last piano that Liszt ever played.
Yeah, I never.
There's a funny story about this. When I was there in 1990, they gave me a studio that was a chapel, and I saw this old Erard piano that had rugs thrown over it, and I lifted the lid, and it said with a brass plaque, this was the last piano that the Abbé Franz Liszt performed on 1886. And I went to the director of the academy and I said, do you realize they have Liszt piano here? And it's rotting in my studio. And they said, yes, we know we have Liszt piano. I said, well, what the hell are you going to do about it? And she looked at me and she said, my dear, when you've grown up walking on the very same stones as Julius Caesar, Liszt's piano is not such a big deal.
Well, as much as I'm enjoying this conversation, our time is coming to a close. I hope you're all as excited for the premiere of An American Mosaic as I am. Please make sure to mark your calendars for December 6th at 2 p.m. Pacific time. Keep your eyes on your email, Oregon Bach Festival social media channels, and the website for more details and ways to view the concert. Richard and Simona, this has been such a pleasure, a gift to my day. So thank you very much to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Bye-bye.